Hey, welcome back. So today we're going to be recording some of the essential observations to make on these building materials throughout the ages observation slides that are provided with the curriculum. So the main thing to catch here is we want to pay close attention to what's being used to build these structures, but also are there any common features we're seeing to these structures, and are there anything that is there anything that that is repeated, and then what sorts of advancements are we seeing as the technology gets better and better and the shelters and general structures improve. So we will jump into that right now. So again, physical science, observations, building materials through the ages. Let's go. All right, so first thing we have here is something that looks a bit like a lean-to. Now, I would say this seems to be made of either grass or leaves, so I'll just note that, grass or leaves. That seems to be the main thing that the structure is made out of. Now, while that is kind of what's providing the shade and maybe shelter there as well, the grass and leaves aren't providing much of the structure. So basically what's providing the structure, we've got, this piece right here, maybe this piece right here, this piece across here. It looks like in the back there we have maybe a larger piece of wood there. So we've also got some wood to provide structure. All right, so a couple of key observations there. Now, again, the grass is what's providing the shelter, and that's also providing shade. So the grass will not only protect from weather, rain, wind, possibly snow, although it looks like we're in a desert, probably not snow. Probably not much rain either, but this is also going to provide shade. So one other thing worth noting is in the bases here of these sticks, the ones that we can see, are kind of piles of earth and stone. So basically what we also have is dirt and stone used to anchor the wood structure. So I'll make a note of that as well. Dirt and stone to anchor wooden structure, to anchor wood structures. All right. So and then I think that's pretty good. Those are kind of the important things to catch for this one. Now there's probably a lot of other details you could know. Like I said, note that we're in a desert. Note that there doesn't seem to be much of this around, so this stuff was probably pretty hard to scrounge together, but I think that pretty much covers the important things to see here. So, moving on. All right, we've got another simple shelter here. Now, this one, again, seems to be made of leaves and twigs. So, leaves and twigs. Twigs. Maybe some grass as well. Now we're in a forest here, and definitely it definitely seems like, just based on the moss that's on the wood and sort of the sky around us, it seems like we're a lot more likely to get rain. So this shelter probably is to sort of keep the rain off. Another thing worth noting is that we have some pieces of wood, again, sort of providing the overall structure. So again, wood provides structure. Now, so this is somewhat similar to the last one we saw. The last one was kind of a single slope. It's worth noting that this has two slopes going in either direction. Now, the key to this, I'll back up a slide to kind of show this. The key to this is basically this one will be great if we're getting rain or wind from the direction, from over this hill that we're looking at. So the shelter will block that. But if the wind or rain is blowing the other way, the shelter isn't going to do much. The advantage of having the two slopes is that now it's protecting from two different directions. So that might be relevant. It's also worth noting we have a fairly small entrance, and we can think about why this needs to be the case. It's got to be entrance so whoever lives in it can get into it. So you need an entrance, but at the same time, that entrance, if you don't have anything to block it, that does leave you somewhat vulnerable to wind or rain or whatever from that direction. So making it as small as you can sort of provides a little bit more protection. Now, one other thing worth noting is it looks like we have larger pieces of wood and perhaps sticks providing anchoring. So in the previous one we had mounds of stones and dirt providing that anchoring. Here we have larger pieces of wood and sticks for anchors. So we can already see sort of a pattern developing here, where we've got these sort of lighter materials that can be dense and block things out, providing, the most of the structure. But we generally need something a little bit more sturdy. In this case, wood. Kind of wood branches, it seems like. Not wood like you go buy in the hardware store, but wood branches that are going to sort of block off you're gonna be able to provide support for the rest of the structure. Now we also need something to anchor that wood to, it seems. So in the previous picture we saw that this was anchored to the piles of stone and dirt. This time it looks to be anchored to other larger pieces of wood, or maybe even sticks that are buried in the ground here. Like this stick looks like it's kind of buried in the ground there to provide anchoring for the shelter. So we're already starting to see some patterns. We'll see if that holds up as we continue to look through. Okay, so had a slight mess up with the camera, but we're back looking at the simple shelter 3. Okay, so a couple of things to note about this one. One, it seems to be made mostly of grass. Not glass, but grass. Now, there definitely seems to be some variation. Like we have this sort of lighter grass on top. So lighter grass providing the overall shelter for the for the structure. But then we've got some heavier looking grasses below providing the structure. So heavier grasses, maybe wood or bamboo or something. I'm kind of pointing at these down here. Heavier grasses providing structure. Now, another thing worth noting is that those heavier grasses, calling those heavier grasses, unclear what they are, so that'll work for now. It's as good as anything. But those heavier grasses are sort of anchored into the ground. They're buried in the ground. So buried in the ground. And this, again, like in the previous structures, is going to provide a bit of an anchor. It's going to improve things and kind of stabilize those things that are providing the overall structure of the shelter. Now, another thing worth noting is we kind of have this sort of dome shape. In the previous ones, we kind of had this sloped shape, this triangle shape. This is sort of a new alternate way of doing things. Now, the advantage to both of these types of shelter is that, water and anything that falls in them will have a tendency to roll off. Now, again, not all of it will roll off instantly, but more so than if the structure was just flat. And so that's something worth keeping in mind that all of these shelters are probably going to have. Okay, so let's take a look at shelter 4. Now, again, what we do see, again, we do have these, and this time it's kind of dual purpose. We do have a slope shape again. So sloped shape. The material definitely seems to be grass, mud, and soil. So the overall form of the structure, the kind of thing that's blocking out the elements, is sort of grass and soil here. And unlike the grasses before, this grass definitely seems to be alive. So it seems like this grass is still living, so it's probably growing up over this structure. And so that means there's probably soil there as well that can keep the grass healthy. Now, one thing you probably noticed is that we do have these pieces of wood providing structure. So larger pieces of wood, I'll say branches of wood, because again, these don't look like real big timbers like we'd see, like you'd buy in the hardware store, but definitely sturdier than grass and soil. So larger branches of wood provide structure. Now, this entire structure seems to be sort of anchored to the ground by virtue of the fact that it's kind of a continuation of the grass growing up, over and kind of forming this structure. So the entire structure seems to be anchored to the ground by the soil and grass. So entire structure seems held down by soil and grass. So definitely, that's definitely something worth picking up on there. Okay, so this structure probably seems even more sturdy than the ones we've been looking at before. Much less likely, probably heavier, less likely to blow away. So kind of an interesting way to do it there. All right, so this structure. Now this is two different pictures. One shows kind of the overall skeleton of the structure, and these are in the same location. They're in the similar location, and then the other is a completed structure. So when I'm looking at, say, the skeleton, it looks like the overall skeleton and thus the overall structure is dome shaped. So we're seeing that occur again, and the structure is made of wood. I think that's a pretty reasonable guess. It's kind of a flexible wood because you can see it's kind of been bent into this dome shape. So maybe it's something that's a little bit more flexible, or maybe they did something to make sure it bent like that. But the overall shelter, this is kind of a new one. The shelter is now made of bark. So shelter made of bark. And that is a new one. So we've seen, grass and leaves and soil, mud even. Bark is kind of a new one. Now, it does have the advantage that it is, it is something that's not too heavy. It can be picked up and then used for shelter. Might be a little bit harder to find, but nevertheless, this does seem to be, a workable option for simple shelters there as well. Okay, so this one. All right, so this one again seems to be, we have wood to provide structure. And again, not huge pieces of wood again, just kind of branches that you might find, in the forest. You might have to look for them, but you might find them. And then the shelter itself, whoa, that was not good. Shelter itself is made of bark. Bark. So again, we have shelter seeming to be made of bark there. Now, it's the way this is anchored into the ground is a little unclear, but maybe it seems like these pieces of wood are kind of sticking into the ground. So maybe the individual anchors aren't as strong as some of the anchors we've seen before, but there are a lot of them. So wood seems to be poking into the ground. Also worth noting, we do have a sloped shape again, so it's round, but it is sloped again. It's not domed like some of the other ones we saw there. Okay, so we're definitely starting to see some patterns here. I'll go over the last simple shelter before we do that, and then we'll come back to to some of the patterns we see. So this is a teepee, and this is a very old photo. So I believe this is an actual photo that was taken of natives to the plains of America, and the kind of shelters they built. So again, what we have here is we have wooden poles providing structure. So wooden poles for structure. These things do look to be fairly well anchored into the ground. Now, again, not like permanently. Like we can see this one just kind of seems to be resting. These ones seem to be pushed into the ground a bit more, just so the thing won't move. But it does seem kind of clear that you will want to be, these things are meant to eventually be moved. You just don't want them slipping and moving under those conditions. So, whoops, again. So anchored into the ground. This time the shelter, it's a little difficult to tell what it is here. I'm looking at it and it looks like it's a bunch of kind of overlapping pieces of cloth. So you can kind of see these things look like different pieces that have kind of been stitched or sewn together. So the shelter looks like cloth, or maybe, knowing what this is, knowing that this is a teepee from the Plains Indians, maybe it's hide. It's not a bad guess. So maybe it's like buffalo hide or other hide from other plains animals like deer or elk. Maybe hide. So cloth or maybe hide. And then our shape, again, we do have this sloped shape that has come up a few times now. So we've seen that multiple times. Now, so kind of what we're seeing here, we'll just go over some of the common elements that we've seen so far. Generally, we have something a little bit sturdier. A lot of times it's wood, maybe sometimes just sturdy grass, providing the overall structure of the shelter. Now, that's not the entire shelter itself. The shelter itself seems to be built out of something lighter. So, we saw grass, we saw leaves. In this case, we're seeing hide, we saw bark. One case, we saw this kind of mixture of soil and mud and grass together, providing the overall, the shelter. But the structure seems to be something fairly sturdy. A lot of times it's wood. And then the two shapes that have come up multiple times are the sloped shape we're seeing here and the domed shape we saw back in this one and this one right here. Okay, so those are two things that's coming up. And lastly, we do see it does seem to be important that there's some way of anchoring the shelter into the ground. So that kind of makes sense. We wouldn't expect these shelters to just kind of be resting on the ground, especially since they're supposed to protect from wind, among other things. We'd want them to be, fixed to the ground so they're not going to blow away too easily. So that's worth, those are some commonalities that keep coming up here. Now we're going to get into, these are still fairly simple shelters, but they're a little different in that they're stone. Now this is actually a picture from an archaeological site, so it kind of looks like this shelter is kind of buried in a hole in the ground, and that's kind of what it is now. But when the structure was originally used, it was just the stone. It's over time, it's been buried by soil. So the main thing to pay attention is the stone. So the materials we are now seeing, and this is, basically everything is made out of this. Smaller stones are making the materials. So smaller stones are making both the walls and the features of the structure themselves. So we don't have a mixture of materials when we're dealing with this one, at least not as apparently. So smaller stones for the shelter. Now we don't have a look at whether or not what the roof of the shelter is doing. So we can't really speak to that. Now, one of the advantages, one of the things we're not seeing as much is we're not seeing these deliberate anchor points. as much as we did with the lighter shelters. So that could be because when you build something out of stone, it's probably just going to be a little bit more sturdy and stay there a little bit better. So that's probably why that's what we're seeing here. So now one thing worth noting is, again, these things are smaller stones. Basically, the stones look small enough to be carried. Now, this is going to contrast with what we're going to see in some of these later structures. So that's just something worth keeping in mind. Now, here's a more complete stone structure. But basically, again, we have sort of it's a little difficult to tell whether or not this is that definitely looks sloped. That kind of looks domed. So maybe it's this combination of slope and dome. And again, the structure, the shelter itself seems to be made of smaller stones. Now, it is worth noticing that the bigger stones, like this one, maybe not so much over here. We do have a bigger stone right here as well. So we do have larger stones near the door. All right, so when we think about why that might be, well, the door is kind of a weak spot of this. Now, we need it because we need to get in, we need to be able to get into the structure, but we can't really afford to have these stones, be weak and cracking at the door, because if that happens, there's nothing around them, in the door area to hold the structure up anymore. So around the door, we do need to have some of these bigger, stronger, sturdier stones that are going to keep everything propped up, because there's nothing inside the doorway to do it. So that is definitely something worth picking up on in this shelter. All right, so looking at stone shelters. Now, we're getting into some more advanced shelters here. Now, this is where we really start getting a hybrid of different materials. So we definitely have wooden walls, and these pieces of wood in the walls, they look fairly sturdy. But we have smaller branches, smaller pieces of wood to give structure. Now, a little unclear how it's doing that. My sense is kind of what I'm talking about here is this thing, this thing, this thing, and then all the little cross pieces there, like so. So it kind of looks to me like what's going on is those smaller pieces of wood are sort of holding the pile of bigger pieces of wood together. So basically, the big pieces of wood are kind of being constrained from falling away by the smaller structural support, or the structural support of the smaller pieces of wood. Now, the door also looks to be made out of wood as well, but probably thinner wood. The roof is made of grass. Roof made of grass. And what we also notice is that the roof is sloped, but the walls are vertical. Now, this was actually something we saw in the previous, starting with stone structures. I didn't mention that. It could be worth pointing that out. But notice that is a bit of a development here. We don't have vertical walls in these simpler structures. I guess in this one we did a little bit, but that's more just kind of a consequence of the dome shape. But a lot of times we don't have much in the way of vertical walls going back here. It's all the walls are sloped until we kind of get to these somewhat more advanced structures where we start having vertical walls and then a sloped roof on top. So that's kind of what's going on here. We look at this one, we see the same thing, but this time the walls are stone. The roof is grass. Looks like grass. And then it's a little unclear, but it looks like those are either very long stones, and they very well could be. It's a little difficult to tell. But those could also be wood. Now, because I can't really tell, I'll leave that alone for now. But again, we do have this combination and this divergence in materials to use, stone for the walls, grass for the roof. Also note that the roof is sloped. One other advance that seems to be happening here on these stone walls versus the previous stone walls is that the stones have mud in between them. So maybe it's some kind of mud that almost acts like concrete. We'll just call it mud for now. But basically, it's to kind of fill in the gaps that these stones leave. And we could think about why that might be the case. Having these little gaps in the stones, it's better than being out in the open, but it's still kind of letting in little bits of cold air, little things like that. So filling in the gaps with something like mud is a way to make the house warmer and more resistant to things like wind. So that's something definitely worth noticing is going on here. All right, so we move to this one. Now, this is a significant advancement. Maybe it may not seem like it, but what we've done here is we have large logs for walls. Okay. Now, you think about this. In most of the cases where we've seen wood being used. For walls, where we've seen wood being used, the pieces of wood have basically been smaller, like small enough to carry. Not so for this one. These large logs, particularly on the sides here, are probably going to take multiple people or maybe animals to help carry. Another thing is we have mud in between the logs. So just like with the previous one, where we sort of had mud in between the stones to seal things out, we've got mud in between the logs. Now this time the roof is still sloped, but it seems to be made out of panels of wood. We call these shingles. So made of wooden shingles. Now, those need to sort of be constructed. You're not generally going to find wood in that shape laying around. Similar sort of thing with the logs. You're probably going to have to go and, take down a tree deliberately to find logs this size and this straight that are still in serviceable condition. So that's definitely something worth keeping in mind here. Another interesting thing going on. We have a chimney. And this is something that's pretty new. We might have seen this maybe in some of the other things, but the use of a chimney here, basically it means we're definitely going to have fire inside. And in a controlled way. Now you gotta remember, this is a benefit. Like having fire. This is bringing a technology inside the home, but it's also dangerous. A lot of the things we've been looking at, they could potentially catch fire. And if your shelter catches fire, not only does that risk you, but it also you could also be left without shelter. That's a double whammy. You don't really want to have to deal with. These chimneys and fireplaces are a way of handling the fire and making it safe, such that you can bring this technology inside and use it to make the shelter a little bit better, a little bit more habitable. So that's an important advancement to catch there. This one, we do have a combination of a bunch of different materials here. So we've got stone walls. And also note we got a chimney there as well. Looks like we've got portions of the walls are wood, like the upper walls are wood. So upper walls and roof are wood. So that's worth noting. We do definitely have some kind of mud or mortar in between stones. So again, to kind of seal the walls off, make sure nothing can get in. Now, another thing, it's a little difficult to tell, but a kind of pretty cool advancement is we've got glass in the windows. So this is another material that's being added. That again, you can have windows before, but again, you want windows to maybe let some cool air in if it's too hot in the shelter. Problem is that lets cold air in when you want to stay warm. The windows are, having glass in your windows are a way to kind of have the best of both worlds. Now, it's not going to be perfect, but it is an improvement. It's a way to include windows in your shelter, but also don't let, all the heat escape, and don't make sure the shelter doesn't get too cold when you want it to be warmer. So those are some we're seeing a lot more advancements. Now, another thing about this one is there very clearly seem to be two stories to it. So we've got, shelter, one level of shelter on the bottom with the stone walls, and then this one definitely seems big enough to have multiple stories in the shelter there. So that's definitely something worth keeping in mind. All right. So moving to large ancient structures. These are, of course, the pyramids at Giza. Now, the pyramids at Giza. The main thing to know here is that these are basically piles of large stones. Okay? Now, much larger than anything we've seen thus far. So any stone shelters we saw constructed before this were nowhere near as large as this, and you can definitely see that. Little difficult to tell from this far away, but the stones are larger than any stones that were used for shelter. Stones that need to be moved by many people, or possibly my machines. So you're not going to get these structures to, last and stand the test of time if they're this big, if they're constructed of just little tiny rocks that people can move around. So this is one of the things you're definitely seeing with these large ancient structures. Moving to another large ancient structure. We're still seeing something similar going on here. So, made from large stones. By the way, this is I believe this is a Mayan pyramid, possibly an Aztec in Mexico. So again, constructed of larger stones, and you can see that these have many stories, and the people are visible on it. So many stories tall. Now, it's a little unclear whether or not this is just a stack of stones or whether there's an interior to it. So we would need to look at that in more detail. But again, very large stone structure that's required a lot of transportation of stone, required a lot of effort to build. One last example of this. This is a Mesopotamian Ziggurat. This is in Iraq. But again, we're seeing similar sorts of patterns where we're using large stones to build tall structures. So that's the common things that these ancient structures had in common, is that you're using significantly bigger stones than you would have seen before, and you're able to build structures that are significantly larger than a person. You can see the people standing at the top there, but structures that are significantly larger than a person, in order, from these large stones. So there had to be some design, some planning, probably a lot more forethought went into these large structures than you would have seen in the smaller, simpler shelters we were looking at before. Okay, going to some ancient Greek structures. This is the Parthenon. And again, this is made of large pieces of stone. Large pieces of stone. Now, one thing worth noticing is that basically this is a ruin, so the roof has been completely gone. It's unclear what the roof is made of, but what we have here is we have deliberate columns, a large number of columns of stone. So, large numbers of columns of stone, and these are lined up. So they're lined up to form not exactly a wall, but definitely, to provide support for the roof of this very large building. Now, again, the roof is gone, but you've got these large columns of stone that were there to provide support for the roof. The next one is actually a drawing of a sort of more. This was a Roman structure. This was the best angle I could get of the structure, but one of the reasons this one is worth including is that you see a lot of different elements that were found in similar structures. So this time we've got the stone pillars or columns. We've got the sloped roof. And we've even got this sort of dome-shaped roof above the on the bigger portion of this building. So dome-shaped roof as well. So we're seeing that, okay, these were simple sort of things that were included in the most basic shelters, yet they keep coming up as structures get more advanced. So this is why it is really helpful to look at and pay close attention to the details of these early structures, because it turns out that the rules that were used to make them will apply later oftentimes as well. Okay, so here we've got a diagram of the Greek houses. Now, of some ancient Greek houses. Now, this would probably be a more expensive Greek house. A more well-to-do person would be living here. But a couple of things worth noting is that we've definitely got a mixture of materials here. So we've got what's going on here? So we've definitely got wooden structures. And you can see, you got some wood structures there, definitely there. So wooden structures. Man, that's annoying. Okay. See, I'm going off. Okay. Wooden structures. Now, again, like before, we have multiple stories. And again, so this is possible in the time of ancient Greece, where we've got rooms with multiple stories going on here. So that's homes with multiple stories. So this is something that was possible a long time ago. Another thing worth noting, down here, we seem to have cooking going on. So, someplace, again, where fire is contained, where you can have cooking going on inside the structure. Sort of in the interior here, we've got a space where it's kind of a common area for the people to hang out. But what we've got over here is, it looks like this is a room for washing. So not only do we have cooking, but we also have rooms for washing. So the kind of the point to see here in this one is that one of the things that we start trying to do with our shelters is bring in sort of these technologies, sort of embed these technologies inside the shelter such that we can make life a little bit more convenient. And that's one of the main things we start to see in the modern structures. So modern structure 1. Now, I just find this picture to be very, very impressive. Now, you might not be able to tell what this is made out of, but the main materials here are going to be steel, concrete, and glass. Now, we saw glass used a little bit in older structures for windows. There's a lot more glass in this building, but glass is kind of it's kind of a fixture. It's not providing the main structure. Concrete, really, what this is sort of a form of pourable stone that it functions just like a stone that you can make into any shape you want. So that's why it's particularly useful for modern structures. Now, steel was not something. This is purely a modern invention. So concrete. It's very likely the Romans had concrete. It's not very likely. The Romans definitely had concrete, and they were able to build some very impressive structures using concrete. The picture of the drawing I showed you is the Pantheon. That structure used concrete as well. But steel is new. And steel is what you're really going to need when you want big, large, towering structures like this. So this second structure is a bridge, also made of steel. So steel and concrete probably on the top, but the most important material here is the steel portion. Now, even when you start to get to more advanced materials, it's worth noting that a lot of these old shapes keep cropping up. So we've got these vertical supports. And we saw this going back to the earliest, simplest shelter where we had to have these vertical supports. Another thing, it's not exactly a dome, but you might have caught the similarity in shape between the way this sort of steel cage is put together and that sort of dome shape we saw in some of those simpler structures. So we definitely still have vertical supports, and we have we'll just call it a dome shape. Turns out there's a better term we'll use for this when we start looking at it more closely, but similar sort of shape to the dome that we saw before. Now, one thing I want to point out at this point, because the next picture doesn't do this, is that even in the images we couldn't see particularly well, one of the things that keeps coming up again and again and again is that we need something to provide the structure. And then we kind of put other things on top of that are going to provide the shelter. In the case of the bridge, are going to provide the surface that the cars and people are going to cross on. But we need something to provide the structure. And that thing that provides the structure we call the frame. So the next set of observations involves you going and looking at different frames. So we can't really see the frame in the next one, which is why I brought it up here. But what we can see is that, one, we've definitely got concrete, steel, and glass, very apparent in this picture. But the main thing to note that is included here, and this is very common in modern structures, but would have been vanishingly rare to the point where it's not there at all in those simpler shelters and even the ancient structures, is we have added electricity here. Now, this is a really impressive embedded technology, and as you are undoubtedly aware, it's a fundamental part of how your home functions and how Almost all modern structures work. Electricity is everywhere. Another thing, we have clean water everywhere. Now, we saw a place for washing in the diagram of the Greek houses, but it was unclear where that water was coming from. Maybe that was brought in from outside. It was unclear. Definitely there was space for washing in the home. But now we've got clean water running directly into these structures and dwellings. So these are two really important embedded technologies that come up in as shelters and human structures get better and better. Okay, so hope you caught all these improvements and commonalities in the structures as we look at them throughout the ages. Going into the next one, we will take a little bit closer look at frames. So I will see you then. Take care.